day in the new book, Data and Statistics, Data About Us. Our first investigation was titled, What's in a Name? Organizing, Representing, and Describing Data. In order to help you with that process, I passed out the note catcher that you see in front of you. And this note catcher is going to be used for quite a few days, so we did not complete it in class. We did, however, talk about data. What is data? And we talked about data being numeric values or opinions that are gathered to answer questions. For example, you might ask how many people have a pet at home. And then in order to answer that question, we'd have to take a survey and we'd gather information, or we call that data. You might ask about people's age. And again, you can take a survey and you collect data. So we're going to learn more and more about what data is throughout the book. The second word we talked about was attribute. An attribute is a characteristic or a feature about a person or an object. So one of the things that we talked about were the different attributes of shoes. Shoes could have laces, or they could have heels or no heels. They could be made of leather or fabric. And so an attribute is just describing the properties of something. Our big focus today was on reviewing frequency tables from grade school, and that you use tally marks, which you see are these little bundles. And tally marks come from just drawing straight lines as you count, and every time you get to number 5, you would cross over. And so one of the things to remember is to use tick marks, and then in groups of 5. That seems to be a skill from elementary school. And that was the only thing we filled out on that page of the note catcher. Then we looked at the second page here, and we talked about a line plot. And we also talked a little bit about the distribution, which is just the shape of the data set as a whole. And when you talk about distribution, the key things in the beginning of this book are to look for clusters. So that's a vocabulary word we want to focus on, in gaps. So for example, if we look at this line plot about the hours of exercising per week for students, we might notice that there is kind of a cluster of numbers here. So we would just, and then there's some gaps here. And so here's another gap. So when we describe something like this, we would just say there's a cluster around 4 and 5, and there's a gap between 0 and 3, and another gap between 6 and 9. Similarly, when we look at the second line plot, hours of exercising per week for coaches, we notice there's smaller clusters. Here's a cluster around 1 and 8, or just maybe a high frequency, which looks to me like, if you look at coaches, each dot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. There's 15 dots, so that represents 15 coaches. And coaches tend to either exercise a lot, maybe 8 hours, or not so much at all. But really, when we look at this, mostly what we see is lots of gaps. There's a cluster around 1, another around 8, and there are gaps throughout the data. So if we were going to summarize the difference between hours of exercising per week for students versus hours of exercising per week for coaches, we might make a summary statement that says coaches tend to exercise a lot or a little, but there aren't very many coaches who exercise for 4 or 5 or 6 hours a week. So they either most coaches seem to exercise 8 hours a week or only 1 hour a week. Where when we look at students, the students tend to have more people in the middle. So the students tend to exercise for 4 or 5 hours a week. More students tend to have a regular exercise pattern, and fewer students exercise many, many hours. There's many things we could say about this data. That would just be the beginning of the conversation. In your book, we talked about letters and names of different cultures. And as we did that, we looked specifically at the names of Chinese students and the names of US students. And we created a frequency table based off of this problem 1.1 in your book. So with this problem 1.1, we took this table and we created a frequency table. And when we finished that, we came up with this here. And we discussed different attributes of Chinese names. So then the next thing we did was we did the exact same thing for US names. And we noticed that the US names seem to be longer in general than the Chinese names, because the longest Chinese names had 9 letters, and that was actually the shortest US name. So we used this data to talk about how to create a line plot, and we did a line plot comparing Chinese names and US names. And that line plot should have been on the back of your lab sheet that you had in class. And if you didn't get a chance to finish the line plot, that would be a good thing to copy down. There was one other thing that we talked about. Your book uses line plots and tends to use X's. And you can also see line plots with dots. So I added another example of line plots, just looking at not Chinese names, but a line plot of the number of Pokemon couches around town. And both diagrams below are line plots, and they represent the same information. For example, right here, it's a little hard to see the numbers, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There were 4 people that made 6 Pokemon couches around town, and that shows the same information in both line plots. So that information would be, there were 4 people that made 6 Pokemon couches around town. Just an example of how to read a line plot. And if you look back in your note catcher, there are also samples of line plots in your note catcher using that Pokemon example, I believe, right? Or using the exercise that we had talked about. And let me bring you back to that picture. There you go. So that's also a line plot using the dots. So in summary, today we talked about a few different things. We talked about some vocabulary words, what a frequency table is, what a line table is, or a line plot is, and how to use those line plots to talk about distribution and compare data.